Hey, everybody. So we are looking at Nehemiah 8. And if you want to, go ahead and read the first three verses, 1 through 3. Just pause this for a second and read 1 through 3, and then we'll start again. So this passage begins with a notation about the time of the year. This was in the 7th month, and that ended up being the Jewish New Year. And so at this point, the exiles that had been exiled were returning. The ones that were going to return were returned. They had already come back. There were some that stayed over in Babylon and that area, and they weren't going to come back. So, but the ones that were there were settled. So that means they were back. Nehemiah had finished the city walls just a few days before this event happens, and then the leaders are calling everybody together. And all the people got together, all the people assembled, and it shows that they were ready to begin this next period in their lives. This was a long process of kind of overhauling Jerusalem's spiritual life. And the hope was that they would unite everybody, because you have to remember there were exiles coming back from being exiled, but there were also people who had never left that got left behind. And so they had lived very different lives for a long time. So it was important to reunite them. So everybody gathered near one of the gates, the water gate, to listen to Ezra read the scroll from the Torah, or the book of instruction. And they asked him to read to them from the instruction scroll, because they realized that in order to rebuild their nation again, that they had to return to their spiritual roots, that it was important. So, and remember, Ezra had returned. I mean, remember, you probably don't know because I didn't know. Excuse me. Ezra had returned more than 10 years before Nehemiah. And so they were working together to reconfigure or rebuild the life of God's people that this exile had really messed up. So who was in the crowd? Well, it was men and women and anyone who could understand. So it probably means there were children too, children that were old enough to understand. And they sat there and listened from early morning until the middle of the day. So you're talking at least 6 hours, maybe more. So, I mean, the fact that they were willing to do that just shows how eager they were to start again. This was their new beginning of their relationship with God, or Yahweh, and it was important to them. They listened attentively. So now pause your video and read verses 4 through 6, and then start it again. So we see that there were 13 people, and we know that because we can count the names, that those really hard names to say listed there, in addition to Ezra, and they were on this platform they'd built. And these were probably like appointed as Levites. They were probably priests. So Ezra was the priest, main priest, and he led the people. And the people raised their hands in prayer, and then they bowed down and worshiped with their faces to the ground. They were really paying homage to God. They were really, really worshiping. They were not going through the motions. They were really meant it. All right, pause and read 7 and 8. So it seems pretty obvious that most of the people they weren't familiar with the words. So why wouldn't they have been familiar? Well, they didn't understand Hebrew anymore. They'd been gone so long that they no longer understood their native language. So they had helpers who were translating the words into Aramaic, and there were the priests were also there to explain the words to them, kind of like what our typical worship service is. We read the scripture, and then Josh, or our pastor, explains the scripture to us in a sermon. And now pause and read 9 through 12. So the main personalities in the text, Ezra and Nehemiah and the Levites, saw as they were reading that the people were moved to tears. I mean, they were so overwhelmed by what he was reading, and realizing how far off they were from their own spiritual life and spiritual journey, that they were crying. But the leaders said, this is not a time to cry and to mourn. This is a celebration. We've rebuilt. This is a celebration. So the good news is this is a holy day, a day dedicated to the Lord. And he said, go out and eat the fat food, eat the really good food, and drink something sweet, and then share what you have with those who didn't prepare for the day. And the emphasis wasn't really on the joy, it was on the community and sharing the good news from the Lord and sharing with each other. And they continued to remind the people that this was a day of joy and celebration, and that it was not a time for grief or guilt. And then just to remind them that God's intention in all of this was their joy. Just to sum it up, the Jewish people had returned from exile. They had rebuilt the temple. They'd rebuilt Jerusalem and the walls around it. And the passage for today, Nehemiah 8, 1-12, is all about their duty to remake their spiritual lives, to rebuild their spiritual lives. And that's what they were doing.